Who were the first humans to look up at the stars and think, what do we make of all this? Which civilizations were first to look around and think to each other, should we talk about this? And who were the first people which sat around and decided to tell stories about the situation they found themselves in? What I'm really talking about is the existential situation. The questions about reality. Some of the most fundamental questions known to mankind. Questions which don't escape anybody. The oldest human to the most modern. Of course, these questions themselves could be tied into our higher consciousness, our ability to conceptualize, imagine, theorize, foresee the future, ponder the past, all of the intellectual capacity which separates us from other animals, our sentience. And I don't mean higher consciousness in some mystical, new age sort of way. I'm really just talking about our differences compared to animals. These questions, such as, what are we doing here? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What is our destiny? What is life? These questions which some days find themselves embedded within memes and online articles and tweets. These questions, although they are sometimes posed in a sort of funny, humorous way these days, they are fundamental, and despite how much you want to sugarcoat it in humor, there's still a certain ground floor of truth to them all. So if you're interested in these forms of questions, especially related to the origins of these questions, a good starting place is the Babylonians and the Mesopotamians. So this brings me to the book that I just want to talk a little bit about today. It's called The Babylonian Genesis by Alexander Heidel. It was published in the 1950s, very close to Alexander Heidel's death. He also has another book related to the Old Testament parallels, very, very similar to this book here, talking about the same concepts and themes, Genesis, creation, history. So we have to always keep in mind that when we're talking about the first humans, origins, the first of anything, we are always limited by the historical record. We're only able to push our knowledge as far as the historical record is able to give us favors. And what I mean by this is that we're limited by the surviving evidence. Things were transmitted in tablets, in stones, in physical matter, whereas today most things are generally transmitted in the digital medium, which itself has a material basis, of course. However, the ancients, they passed down their stories, their tales, their myths in scriptures, in books, in tablets. So this was their main form of transmission. So whenever we're talking about the origins of anything, we have to keep this in mind, okay? Things decay over time, things are buried, civilizations, they come, they rise, new empires, they come and destroy and purge the previous empires' holdings and collections and stories, and they start anew. But fortunately, we still have surviving evidence from the Mesopotamians and the Babylonians. And these are stories such as Enuma Elish, stories which are the focus of this book itself. So Alexander Heidel starts off by doing essentially a translation or a depiction of the original Enuma Elish. He talks about the fragments themselves, where the fragments were missing. Now the Enuma Elish is a story of origin. Okay, it's a story of Genesis. It's a story of where and when was the earth formed, where were the planetary bodies formed, the heavens, the stars. So we're talking about a cosmogony. Where was life formed? And also, where are the origins of the gods? How were the gods formed? Are we all governed by inanimate deities and forces, or are we governed by chaotic natural events? Are we governed by gods? What are we necessarily governed by? Who controls us? Where is our past? Where are we going? Okay, as you can see here, a whole slew of questions is jumping out of this box related to the origins of creation, okay? These are fundamental questions which are generally addressed by religious groups, religious texts themselves, and hot topics of essentially theology. So the Enuma Elish is the first sort of one of the oldest creation stories available to us today. And Alexander Heidel, he talks about this in Enuma Elish, and then he draws parallels to the Old Testament. So keep in mind, this is pre-Old Testament. These are some of the first creation stories, and they're very, very important to analyze because they give us insight into what the early humans would have been thinking. It's quite nice to be able to draw these parallels from our stories to their stories and find the common features that we have amongst us. And, keep in mind, we're obviously all humans, right? We didn't evolve over 4,000 years, some sophisticated mechanisms. We didn't evolve anything sort of intellectually over the past 4,000 years. Most sort of evolutionary biologists seem to think that we've been anatomically modern for 100 to 200,000 years, if not longer, depending on where you want to grade things. So we're not going to be too different from these people. However, what is going to be potentially starkly different is our culture and our modes of reproduction. How do we make a living, and what do we value and what do we care for, and how do we see the world? What is our cosmology? That is one of the big differences which the ancients have compared to us. What is their cosmology? What is our cosmology? And what do you make of this place you find yourself in? One of the most fundamental existential questions which the ancients were dealing with in the Enuma Elish. So the Babylonian Genesis talks about this. It's a conception of the creation of the gods and the creation of society. So it's essentially essential reading if you're thinking of about origins, and if you're a student of religious texts and creation stories and mythologies, you'll definitely like this. I myself am not a student. I'm really just curious. I'm curious about the origins of mind and thought, so I thought I'd actually go and read this thing to see what the ancients were talking about, the Babylonians were talking about. One thing which I was actually quite surprised about was the change in the structure of the gods from one civilization to another. Okay, depending on who was in power, the creation stories bend to this person's sort of will. So if a certain emperor is in power and he values a certain sort of narrative, this is the narrative which will get pushed, and this is the narrative which will get told and transmitted. Whereas if another ruler is in power, maybe they favor a different narrative of creation, which sort of suits their political, economic, colonial needs, and therefore they push this narrative upon the people, and then this narrative becomes more popular. As we can see here, religion and creation and myth is used in some senses as a control device. It's used in a way to coerce people to act in a certain way, and it's manipulated by rulers. So from the earliest signs of the first creation stories, we can see that much like the manipulation by the Roman state of the churches and of the biblical texts, you also have the manipulation of these more ancient texts by the ruling powers at that time. And it's quite sad sometimes when you think about something which is a metaphysical question, which is an existential question and a fundamental ontological question. When you think about texts talking about that, it's sad to think that they are manipulated in the strategically to gain power and to gain resources and so on and so forth. So this is what this book talks about. You can't necessarily critique this book, okay? It's really just a collection of scripts of the Babylonian Genesis stories. That's what it does. It talks about that. One of the more interesting components of this book, aside from just thinking about the way these people would have been looking at the world, is the Old Testament parallels, which he goes moderately into depth with. A lot of people have theorized that the Bible itself isn't an original work, that it's been collected over thousands of years. The Hebrew writers at the time went and traveled, and through commerce, stories were transmitted. Alexander Heidel generally just concludes that for the most part, although there are similar sort of themes in a lot of these other creation stories, the separation of the heavenly bodies, okay, before matter there was a sort of eternal space. There's many common themes which are consistent amongst the Bible and the Hebrew texts and these creation stories. Alexander Heidel doesn't really think that the Bible, the Old Testament, directly borrowed from this text word for word, because he finds a very little translation, a very little layover. So unless the scribes at the time were actually just taking the text, interpreting it, and then rewriting it, sort of paraphrasing it, you can't necessarily say that the Old Testament was coming from this ancient text. So I don't want to go too much on a tangent about this. Overall, it's an interesting thing to really think about, because all of these creation stories have an origin, and they all have a historical link, right? You have trade routes, you have people exchanging ideas, going over from one country to the next, from one region over to the second, and they're talking about things. They're eating together, they're drinking together, they're exchanging cultural ideas. They are telling stories around fires. I mean, who knows fires, right? That's quite a cliche thing, but I mean, they're transmitting their ideas, and they're talking about the way that they see life, and they're talking about the way they see the stars, and if it's similar to the way others see the stars, and what they really make of existence. These stories, for the most part, Heidel believes that they were more oral in narrative. They weren't necessarily written texts, okay? These things were probably just transmitted. They were common knowledge. Everybody sort of probably knew it, and everybody was familiar with these creation stories. It wasn't an exclusive thing, and because of that, there was probably many authors. Heidel has a very hard time tracing back, and the anthropologists themselves have a very hard time tracing back who the original authors of these texts, because it's really quite unknown. These things, they change over time. A certain form of the Babylonian Genesis changes from one ruler to the next, as I previously said, and because of that, it can be quite hard having some continuity across time, because these things change. So what you really have to do is piece this together over time. Not only is it a theological, religious endeavor, it's first and foremost an archaeological endeavor, because we can only start interpreting and understanding these stories once the archaeologists have excavated and recovered these surviving fragments. So we're really just lucky that we have at least something available to us today. And it really makes you wonder whether we will have the same fates, whether the things we talk about today and the things we hold sacred will also be buried and carried on to civilizations which follow ours. So overall, just to wrap things up, it's just a book which is the bedrock for stories of creation and Genesis. Okay, they are some of the oldest and earliest stories of the origins of the world, what to make of reality, what to make of the gods, how the gods were created. All of these fundamental, very, very deep and essentially unanswerable questions. This is the bedrock for it. So if you're interested in these things, if you're a student of this, if you're very, very curious about these things, this is one of the great books in the collection. Interestingly, on Wikipedia, when you type in the Enuma Elish, a lot of the references themselves are from this book or Heidel's other book. So it just goes to show that this is one of the prime texts in the field. If by any chance someone who is specialized in this field happens to watch this video, if I'm getting some things wrong here, by all means correct me, right? I'm by no means do I think I'm an expert, okay? I'm really just as someone who's curious and someone who's interested in some of these concepts and themes, ancient cultures, and how humans in ancient times thought of the world and how they conceptualized the world and how they visualized the world. These are the things I'm interested in, okay? And if you're interested in similar things, I highly recommend this book. So I hope everyone has a great day, and thank you very much for listening, and enjoy.